The frozen forests of Belgium held their breath. It was the morning of December 16, 1944, and somewhere in the snow-crusted Ardennes, a Tiger tank commander named Obersturmführer Werner Rahn peered through the narrow vision slit of his King Tiger. The air smelled of pine and diesel. His crew sat in tense silence, their breaths fogging in the cramped steel interior. They believed they were invincible. The Tiger II was the most formidable tank in the world, over 70 tons of German engineering wrapped in armor so thick that nothing the Americans fielded could penetrate its frontal plate. Its 88mm gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, and yet, within days, Rahn and thousands of German soldiers would discover something that would shatter their confidence entirely. Not another tank, not a better gun, but a shell that exploded before it even hit the ground. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The weapon was called the VT fuze, short for variable time, though the name was deliberately misleading. It wasn't about time at all. It was a miniature radio transmitter and receiver packed into the nose of an artillery shell, a device so advanced that it defied what German engineers believed was possible. The fuse worked by sending out radio pulses that bounced back from the ground or any nearby target. When the signal reached a certain threshold, it detonated the shell 30 to 50 feet above the battlefield, raining down lethal fragments with surgical precision. For soldiers in trenches, it was devastating. For crews inside tanks, it was a nightmare they hadn't prepared for. The German commanders in the Ardennes offensive had planned for many contingencies. They had stockpiled fuel, assembled elite panzer divisions, and launched their attack under the cover of bad weather, to avoid Allied air superiority. But they had not planned for this, because they didn't know it existed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of the VT fuze began far from the battlefields of Europe. It started in the laboratories of America and Britain, where scientists faced a seemingly impossible challenge. How do you create a device small enough to fit inside an artillery shell, durable enough to survive the violent shock of being fired from a gun, and sophisticated enough to sense the proximity of a target moving at hundreds of miles per hour? The answer required innovations that pushed the boundaries of what 1940s technology could achieve. To understand what made this weapon so revolutionary, you have to grasp the brutal physics involved. When an artillery shell is fired from a 5-inch naval gun or a 105mm howitzer, it experiences an acceleration force of up to 20,000 times the force of gravity, 20,000 Gs, instantly. In that fraction of a second, every component inside the shell is subjected to forces that would pulverize ordinary electronics. Add to that the fact that the shell is spinning at up to 30,000 revolutions per minute as it travels through the rifled barrel, creating immense centrifugal forces, and the challenge becomes clear. You're not just building a radio, you're building a radio that has to survive being shot out of a cannon. The British had been experimenting with proximity fuses since 1939, but their designs were intended for bombs and rockets, which experienced far gentler acceleration forces of around 100 Gs. When the TISAD mission arrived in the United States in September 1940, carrying Britain's most guarded military secrets, the proximity fuse concept was among the treasures shared. American scientists, led by physicist Merle Tuve at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, took the British research and pushed it further. They had access to something the British lacked at scale: miniature vacuum tubes originally designed for hearing aids. These tiny glass tubes, about the size of a pencil eraser, became the heart of the fuse, but they had to be ruggedized beyond anything previously attempted. Researchers mounted the tubes in blocks of plastic, coated them in wax, and tested them in ways that bordered on the absurd. They fired bullets at them. They dropped them from the tops of buildings. They even fired them from homemade cannons. And slowly, painstakingly, they developed tubes that could survive the unthinkable. By January 1942, the T3 fuse had a 52% success rate against water targets. It wasn't perfect, but the US Navy accepted it. The war demanded progress, not perfection. The fuse itself was an engineering marvel. Inside the shell's nose sat a miniature radio transmitter that sent out continuous pulses at a frequency of around 180 MHz. The shell's body acted as the antenna. As the shell approached a target, whether an aircraft, the ground, or a solid object, the reflected radio waves bounced back. The fuse measured the difference between the transmitted and reflected signals, a phenomenon called the Doppler effect. When the reflected signal reached a certain amplitude, it triggered a thyrotron tube, an electronic switch that initiated the detonation sequence. The entire system had to be powered by a battery, but conventional batteries of the era had limited shelf lives. The solution was ingenious. The fuse used a wet cell battery that was installed dry. A small glass vial filled with electrolyte sat inside the fuse. When the shell was fired, the centrifugal force shattered the vial, distributing the electrolyte to metal contacts around it. A chemical reaction began, generating electricity. The battery armed the fuse and powered the radio circuit. All of this happened in the first few seconds of flight. If the shell didn't detonate within a certain time, a self-destruct mechanism ensured it would explode harmlessly, preventing the enemy from capturing an intact fuse. By mid-1943, the fuse had proven itself in the Pacific. On January 5, 1943, the cruiser USS Helena fired VT-fused shells at retreating Japanese dive bombers near Guadalcanal. One of the aircraft was destroyed not by a direct hit, but by a shell that exploded near enough to shred its airframe with shrapnel. It was the first confirmed kill using proximity fuses in combat. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was immediate. Anti-aircraft fire that once required thousands of rounds to bring down a single aircraft now needed only a fraction of that ammunition. The fuse was so effective that it increased lethality by 5 to 10 times compared to traditional time or contact fuses. But for all its success at sea, the Pentagon was adamant. The fuse could not be used over land. The risk was too great. If a dud shell fell into enemy hands, German or Japanese engineers might reverse engineer the technology and turn it against the Allies. Imagine, they warned, German anti-aircraft guns equipped with proximity fuses defending the Reich. Allied bomber losses would skyrocket. The daylight bombing campaign might collapse, so the fuse remained restricted to naval operations and, later, to anti-aircraft defense in Britain against the German V-1 flying bombs. But everything changed in December 1944. On the morning of December 16th, German forces launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, the offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by hundreds of tanks including Tiger IIs, Panthers, and Panzer IVs, smashed through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest. The weather was miserable. Thick clouds and snow grounded Allied aircraft, giving the Germans the cover they needed. For the first time since D-Day, the Wehrmacht was on the offensive, and the situation was desperate. American commanders scrambled to respond. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, made a decision that had been unthinkable just weeks earlier. He demanded permission to use VT fuses over land. The Pentagon, which had guarded the secret so jealously, relented within days. By December 19th, just 3 days after the German attack began, Eisenhower received formal clearance. 2 days later, all restrictions were lifted. Over 200,000 VT-fused artillery shells, codenamed POSIT, were rushed to the front lines. The German soldiers advancing through the Ardennes had no idea what was coming. The first use of the fuse on the European continent came almost immediately. On the morning of December 16th, Colonel George Axelson, commander of the 406th Artillery Group, faced a difficult decision. His guns were in position near Monschau, Germany, and the lightly armed 38th Cavalry Squadron was under heavy attack. They needed artillery support. Axelson had just received a shipment of the new VT-fused shells, but Eisenhower's official authorization hadn't arrived yet. He decided the emergency overrode protocol. He ordered his gunners to load the secret ammunition and fire. The shells screamed overhead and detonated 30 feet above the advancing German infantry. The effect was catastrophic. Soldiers who had been crouching in foxholes, believing themselves safe from artillery, were cut down by shrapnel raining from above. Trenches offered no protection. Neither did the dense forest canopy. The airbursts shredded tree branches, sending splinters flying like secondary projectiles. Communication wires strung between German positions were severed. Panic spread. Some German soldiers, unnerved by the relentless, precise barrage, charged directly toward the American lines with their hands raised, shouting, "Kamerad!" They preferred capture to enduring another minute under that hellish fire. General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army, was among the first to recognize the weapon's impact. On the night of December 25th and 26th, American artillery equipped with VT fuzzes fired on German forces near Echternach. By actual count, 702 German soldiers were killed in a single battalion concentration. Patton later wrote to the War Department, "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion which was trying to get across the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. I am glad that you all thought of it first. The fuse wasn't just changing tactics, it was rewriting the rules of land warfare." German commanders, accustomed to maneuvering their forces under the cover of forests and using terrain for protection, suddenly found their advantages nullified. The airbursts turned forests into kill zones. Reverse slopes of hills, traditionally safe from direct fire, were no longer sanctuaries. The shells detonated above the ground, sending fragments downward at lethal angles. For German tank crews, the VT fuse presented a unique terror. The Tiger II, with its massive armor, could shrug off direct hits from most Allied tank guns. Its frontal plate was nearly impenetrable, but armor designed to stop kinetic projectiles was far less effective against airbursts. When a VT fused shell detonated above a tank, the fragments rained down on the thinner top armor. Engine decks, vulnerable to shrapnel, were damaged. Optics were shattered. Radio antennas were severed. And if the crew had been riding with hatches open, as they often did for visibility and ventilation, the results were gruesome. The psychological impact was perhaps even more devastating than the physical damage. German soldiers had been trained to dig in, to use cover, to rely on their superior armor and firepower. But the VT fuse stripped away those advantages. There was no hiding from a weapon that exploded above you. Prisoners of war repeatedly spoke of the demoralizing effect of the airbursts, especially at night when the flashes lit up the sky and the shrapnel sang through the darkness. One intelligence report noted that German commanders offered rewards for soldiers who could recover an intact fuse. They desperately wanted to understand how the weapon worked, but the fuses were designed with self-destruct mechanisms, and those that survived impact were often too damaged to provide useful intelligence. What the Germans didn't know was that they had already captured 20,000 VT fuses during the Battle of the Bulge. In the chaos of the early offensive, German forces overran an American ammunition depot. Among the supplies were crates of the secret shells, but German engineers, who had been working on proximity fuse concepts of their own, had already concluded that such a device was impossible. The acceleration forces involved in artillery fire, they believed, would destroy any electronic system fragile enough to fit inside a shell. So when they examined the captured ammunition, they didn't recognize what they had. The fuses were catalogued, stored, and forgotten. It was one of the great intelligence failures of the war. Meanwhile, American engineers, fearful that the Germans might eventually figure it out, rushed to develop electronic countermeasures. 200 jammers were hastily constructed and installed in American bombers flying over Europe, but the jammers were never needed. The Germans never deciphered the secret, and the VT fuse continued to rain devastation on the Wehrmacht. By the time the Battle of the Bulge ended in late January 1945, the German offensive had been decisively crushed. The fuse had played a critical role. Patton would later claim, somewhat hyperbolically, that the funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. While that was an overstatement, there was truth in it. The fuse had multiplied the effectiveness of American artillery, turning near misses into kills and making defensive positions untenable. It forced German commanders to abandon tactics they had relied on for years. It demoralized troops who had believed themselves safe, and it contributed to the rapid collapse of German resistance in the West. But the story of the VT fuse wasn't over. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany in early 1945, the fuse continued to prove its worth. During the 3 months from the Battle of the Bulge to the crossing of the Rhine, proximity fuzzed anti-aircraft fire brought down over 1,000 German aircraft. The Luftwaffe, already crippled by fuel shortages and attrition, found itself unable to contest Allied air superiority, and on the ground, the fuse became a standard tool of American artillery, used in everything from divisional howitzers to tank destroyer guns. The German tank crews who survived the Ardennes learned to fear the sound that preceded the airbursts. It wasn't the whistle of an incoming shell, which they were trained to recognize and react to. It was something more insidious, a series of sharp cracks overhead, almost like thunder, followed by the metallic patter of shrapnel against armor. In the confines of a Tiger or Panther, where visibility was already limited, the psychological toll was immense. You couldn't see the threat. You couldn't dodge it. All you could do was button up the hatches, reduce visibility even further, and hope the fragments didn't find a weak spot. Obersturmführer Werner Rahn, the Tiger commander who had entered the Ardennes with such confidence, found his worldview shattered within the first week of combat. His Tiger II had been assigned to Kampfgruppe Paper, the spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army's advance. On paper, his unit was unstoppable. 30 King Tigers supported by Panthers and mechanized infantry. They were supposed to punch through to the Meuse River and beyond, splitting the Allied armies and forcing a negotiated peace. But reality had other plans. The roads were narrow and muddy. Bridges collapsed under the weight of the 70-ton Tigers. Fuel shortages plagued the advance from the start. And then there was the artillery. Rahn's first encounter with VT fuzzed shells came on December 19th, near the town of Stoumont. His Tiger was hull down behind a ridge, firing at American positions across a valley. The counter-battery fire began almost immediately. He heard the familiar sound of shells arcing overhead, but instead of impacting the ground or exploding against trees, they detonated in mid-air. The first burst was 50 meters away, the second was 30, the third exploded directly above his tank. The noise inside the turret was deafening. Fragments ricocheted off the armor with sharp pings and clangs. The radio antenna snapped. The commander's periscope cracked. And when Rahn instinctively ducked, he felt something warm on his face. Blood. A tiny fragment had entered through the vision slit, grazing his cheek. It was a minor wound, but the realization was profound. The thickest armor in the world couldn't protect him from a weapon that attacked from above. His gunner, a veteran named Schroeder, looked at him with wide eyes. "What kind of shell is that?" Rahn had no answer. All he knew was that they needed to move. Staying in one position under that kind of fire was suicide. But moving a Tiger II, especially on the narrow, icy roads of the Ardennes, was a slow process. By the time they repositioned, 2 more airbursts had detonated nearby, one close enough to shred the camouflage netting draped over the turret. That evening, back at the improvised command post, Rahn spoke with other tank commanders. They had all experienced the same phenomenon. One Panther commander described his tank's engine catching fire after fragments penetrated the engine deck. Another reported losing his loader to shrapnel that entered through an open hatch. The fear was spreading. These were men who had fought on the Eastern Front, who had survived Kursk and the retreat through Ukraine. They were not easily rattled. But this weapon, this invisible killer that struck from above, unnerved them in ways that Soviet tanks and anti-tank guns never had. The American artillery crews firing those shells had no idea of the terror they were causing. To them, the VT fuse was simply a better tool. They received the new ammunition with minimal fanfare, a brief demonstration, some technical instructions, and an admonition to keep the fuses dry and handle them carefully. The mechanics were straightforward. Set the fuse for airburst mode, load the shell, aim using the same fire control procedures as always, and fire. The fuse did the rest. What made it revolutionary was not complexity but reliability. A traditional time fuse required the gunner to estimate the range to the target, calculate the shell's flight time, and manually set the fuse before loading. If the calculation was off by even a second, the shell would explode too early or too late, wasting ammunition and giving the enemy time to take cover. The VT fuse eliminated that guesswork. It detonated at the optimal height automatically, regardless of terrain or atmospheric conditions. For artillery crews, it was a dream come true. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Sergeant Lou Celentano, serving with the 825th Tank Destroyer Battalion, witnessed the impact firsthand. His unit was equipped with M36 tank destroyers, mounting 90mm guns, and they had received a limited supply of VT fused ammunition. On December 23rd, his battalion was tasked with defending a crossroads near Bastogne. German infantry, supported by armour, were probing the American lines. Celentano's crew loaded VT rounds and waited. When the German infantry advanced through a tree line, the Americans opened fire. The shells detonated 30 feet above the ground, just below the canopy. The effect was immediate and brutal. The advancing soldiers were caught in the open, with no cover from the airbursts. The attack faltered, then broke. Survivors retreated, leaving behind dozens of dead and wounded. Celentano later described it as the most effective fire mission he had ever seen. It was like the shells knew where to go, he said. We didn't have to adjust, we didn't have to guess, we just fired, and they worked. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But for every American soldier who marveled at the fuse's effectiveness, there was a German soldier who cursed it. German after-action reports from the Ardennes, captured later by Allied intelligence, painted a grim picture. One battalion commander wrote that his men refused to leave their positions after experiencing an airburst barrage. They believe the Americans have a weapon that can see through trees and detonate above any target, he reported. Morale is collapsing. Another report described an entire company abandoning their assault after a sustained VT barrage near Malmedy. The soldiers, many of them teenagers conscripted in the final months of the war, simply could not endure the psychological pressure. The airbursts, combined with the harsh winter conditions and dwindling supplies, broke their will to fight. By late December, German commanders were issuing orders forbidding soldiers from discussing the miracle weapon to prevent panic from spreading further. The technical specifications of the VT fuse, once declassified after the war, revealed just how sophisticated the system was. The Mark 53 fuse, one of the most common variants used in Europe, contained over 130 miniature electronic components packed into a space no larger than a soda can. The vacuum tubes, each smaller than a thimble, were mounted on shock-absorbent platforms to survive the 20,000 G acceleration. The radio transmitter operated at 180 MHz, a frequency chosen because it was less susceptible to interference from ground clutter or weather. The receiver circuit was tuned to detect the Doppler shift in the reflected signal, a change in frequency that indicated the shell was approaching a solid object. When the reflected signal reached a predetermined threshold, the thyrotron tube fired, sending an electrical pulse to the detonator. The entire sequence, from firing to detonation, took less than 20 seconds. What made the fuse even more remarkable was its production scale. By the end of the war, over 22 million VT fuses had been manufactured, involving 87 different companies operating 110 factories across the United States. The Crosley Corporation alone produced over 5 million fuzzes, employing 10,000 workers in round-the-clock shifts. The cost per unit had dropped from several $100s in early prototypes to just $18 by 1945. It was a testament to American industrial capacity, the ability to take a cutting-edge technology and mass-produce it at a scale that overwhelmed the enemy. The Germans, by contrast, had pursued their own proximity fuse programs throughout the war. Over 30 different designs were developed or researched, including acoustic fuses triggered by engine noise, electrostatic fuses based on capacitance, and radio fuses similar to the American design, but none ever entered service. The Germans lacked the industrial base to mass-produce the miniature vacuum tubes. They lacked the resources to test and refine the designs under combat conditions. And by the time they realized the Americans had solved the problem, it was too late. The impact of the VT fuse extended beyond the immediate battlefield. It changed how artillery was employed, how infantry maneuvered, and how commanders planned operations. Before the fuse, artillery was primarily used for suppression, to keep enemy heads down while friendly forces advanced. With the VT fuse, artillery became a precision instrument of destruction. It could clear tree lines, destroy communication networks, and deny terrain to the enemy without requiring direct observation. Fire missions that once took dozens of rounds to achieve effect now required only a handful. Ammunition expenditure dropped, logistical burdens eased, and artillery became more responsive. For the Allies, it was a force multiplier that compounded their already significant advantages in firepower and industrial production. For the Germans, it was another nail in the coffin of their war effort. They were already outgunned, outmanned, and outproduced. The VT fuse simply widened the gap further. By January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was effectively over. The German offensive had stalled, then collapsed. The Allies had retaken the ground lost in the initial attacks and were pushing toward the Rhine. The Wehrmacht's losses in the Ardennes were catastrophic. Over 100,000 casualties, 600 tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned, and the last reserves of fuel and ammunition expended. The 6th Panzer Army, which had been the spearhead of the offensive, was a shell of its former self. Of the 30 King Tigers assigned to Kampfgruppe Peiper, only a handful made it back to German lines. Most were abandoned in La Glaise and Stoumont when fuel ran out. Among them was Tiger No. 213, the command tank of an SS Obersturmführer named Dollinger. The tank was captured intact by American forces, its thick armor, scarred by countless impacts but still operational. It stands today in a Belgian museum, a silent witness to the battle. Werner Rahn, the Tiger commander who had entered the Ardennes with such confidence, did not make it back. His Tiger was abandoned on December 24th near Stoumont after the engine failed, and no fuel was available to continue. He and his crew joined the retreat on foot, trudging through snow and avoiding American patrols. Of the 5 men in his crew, only 3 survived the war. Rahn himself was captured in early January and spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner camp in France. In post-war interviews, he spoke about the Ardennes with a mixture of bitterness and resignation. "We believed our tanks were invincible," he said. "We believed our training and experience would carry us through, but the Americans had something we couldn't counter, not just more tanks or more planes. They had technology that turned our advantages into liabilities. The airbursts, the artillery that never missed. It was like fighting an enemy who could see everything and strike everywhere. We never had a chance." The VT fuse's success in Europe was mirrored in the Pacific, where it continued to devastate Japanese forces. In the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, VT-fused bombs dropped from American aircraft silenced Japanese anti-aircraft batteries before the main bombing raids arrived. In naval engagements, proximity-fused shells turned kamikaze attacks, which had been terrifyingly effective, into manageable threats. The USS Hadley and USS Evans, 2 destroyers defending against a massive kamikaze assault on May 11, 1945, used VT-fused ammunition to shoot down dozens of attacking aircraft. The ships survived, though battered, and the fuse was credited with saving hundreds of lives. By the end of the war, the VT fuse had proven itself in every theatre, against every type of target. It had changed the nature of anti-aircraft defense, transformed artillery into a precision weapon, and forced enemies to abandon tactics that had served them for decades. The German engineers who examined captured VT fuses after the war were stunned. They had believed the technology was impossible, that the stresses involved in firing an artillery shell would destroy any electronic system. When they saw the American design, with its ruggedized vacuum tubes, shock-mounted components, and ingenious battery system, they realized how far behind they had fallen. One engineer, a man named Kruger who had worked on German proximity fuse research, wrote in his notes, "We underestimated the Americans. We thought they lacked the sophistication to solve the technical challenges, but they didn't solve them with sophistication. They solved them with brute force engineering, mass production, and a willingness to accept imperfection in pursuit of effectiveness. We were trying to build the perfect fuse. They built a good enough fuse and made 22 million of them. That's the difference between losing and winning a war." The moral of the VT fuse story is not just about technology, it's about adaptability, about the willingness to share knowledge and collaborate across borders. The British provided the initial research. The Americans provided the industrial capacity and engineering know-how. Together, they created a weapon that neither could have developed alone. It's a reminder that, in war, as in peace, cooperation and innovation often matter more than sheer firepower. The Germans had excellent tanks, skilled soldiers, and experienced commanders, but they were isolated, starved of resources, and unable to keep pace with Allied technological advances. The VT fuse was just one example of how the Allies' combined strengths overwhelmed the Axis powers. And there's another lesson, darker but no less important. The human cost of war is never limited to the battlefield. The VT fuse saved countless Allied lives by making artillery more effective and reducing the need for costly assaults. But it also inflicted horrific casualties on German soldiers, many of them young conscripts who had no say in the war's conduct. The fragments from those airbursts killed indiscriminately, and the psychological trauma lingered long after the guns fell silent. Today, the VT fuse is remembered as one of the most important technological innovations of World War II, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. Its descendants are found in every modern military, from guided missiles to smart munitions. The principles developed by Merle Tuve and his team at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory laid the groundwork for decades of advances in electronics, miniaturization, and signal processing. The fuse was more than a weapon. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration that complex electronic systems could be made rugged, reliable, and mass-producible. And in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, where German tank crews once believed themselves invincible, the VT fuse delivered a lesson they would never forget, that in war, as in life, the advantage often goes not to the strongest or the most heavily armoured, but to the most adaptable and innovative. The skies over Germany fell silent in May 1945. The Wehrmacht surrendered. The Tiger tanks, once symbols of German might, sat abandoned in fields and forests across Europe, their thick armour no match for the relentless tide of Allied firepower and ingenuity. And in the archives of military history, the VT fuse earned its place as the weapon that turned near misses into kills, that stripped away the protection of terrain and armour, and that helped bring an end to the deadliest conflict in human history. The Germans never expected VT shells to obliterate their forces with 20,000 Gs of precision engineering. But that's exactly what happened. And in the end, the lesson was clear. In modern warfare, the battle is won not just with courage and steel, but with science, innovation, and the willingness to turn the impossible into reality. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.